Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Leveraging Community Assets to Enhance Your Nonprofit's Impact. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you here for the first time, I'm so glad you're joining us today. My name is Yvonne Sims, Network Engagement Manager for Candid based in Atlanta, and I'm joined by Ebony Carroll, Network Engagement Assistant also based in Atlanta. We'll be supporting today's webinar behind the scenes, as well as collecting questions you ask along the way and posing them during the Q&A. For those of you joining us for the first time, we want to share with you that we joined forces with GuideStar to form a new single organization called Candid. Together, we have over 88 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that an effective social sector is critical for a thriving society, and we believe in the importance of solutions for the sector, by the sector. With Candid, nonprofits, foundations, donors, and the public can all be on the same page. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects the people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. I would now like to turn the controls over to our speaker for today. I'm very excited about this, by the way. Our speaker for today, Diamond Harges. He is a faculty member of the Asset-Based Community Development, so ABCD, Institute, community organizer, creator of the Learning Tree, chairperson of the Grassroots Grantmakers Association Board, and featured in the new documentary, The Antidote, on Kindness in America. He is a frequent speaker on ABCD in secular and religious groups around the world and is a layperson at Broadway UMC, Indianapolis, Indiana. Diamond's role is to listen and discover the gifts, passions, and dreams of citizens in his community and to find ways to utilize them in order to build community, economy, and mutual delight. The bulk of Diamond's work is based on the principles and practices of the asset-based community development that brings neighbors and institutions together to discover the power of being a good neighbor. He builds on what is already present and is in place in a neighborhood, using those formerly undiscovered assets to connect and empower rather than only from the community's needs and deficits. Diamond now describes his role on this planet as the social banker. He utilizes the intangible currencies that are cultivated and used by human assets and relationships to build a more abundant community. We love that so much, and I'll turn it over to him.
All right. Thank you, Yvonne, for the kind introduction. And even though I don't see you all, I see you, Sabona, which means I see you. So just a little bit about me. I live in Indianapolis, Indiana. I work with this group called the Learning Tree, and we're a co-op firm. We do professional development, some community organizing, strategic planning, and strategic design. We all live in the northwest side of Indianapolis, so we all live in a few block radius. We take 30% of our income and we reinvest it back in the 10 block radius around where we live at. So before we get into our topic around asset-based community development, I really want to talk about what does it mean for an institution to be ready for this. And around 2006, I started a project called the Roving Listener in my neighborhood where I was living at, and my church had sponsored me. This neighborhood was a place where everything bad. It was lots of folks that are undervalued, people not recognized, and then the only way people were known by either zip code or how many police runs. But there were a lot more places ready for that. At the time, our church wasn't ready, and they had to figure out what it was to be ready to do this work and step into this space. So some of the questions we asked: what are we willing to share, or what are we willing to give up? What are we willing to give up is super important because you can't do new things if you have old practices. So we had to create a way to grieve things. The other thing we had to do is to figure out how we might share power with our neighbors, because we are a power broker. We controlled all the food pantries, we did all our programs, but we're talking about sharing people's gifts, and we needed to figure out ways to share ours. The other question was, who are we willing to learn from, right? This is important because we can't learn what we don't know. Who are we asking from the people we serve, our neighbors, people who live around our institutions? How are we learning from them? What gifts are you willing to invest in? And we're going to be talking about what that means about gifts and talents. But one of our iron rule is never ask for someone's gifts if you're not prepared to use it. So asset-based community development, what is that? The short term is ABCD. It is a sustainable community strategy to develop communities beyond the mobilization of particular community. Asset-based community development concerned with how to link micro assets to the macro environment. The appeal of asset-based community development lies in the premise that communities can drive the development process themselves by identifying and mobilizing the existing but often unrecognized assets. That means the things that are already going on that we need to tie together. Asset-based community development builds on what we already have in our community and mobilize those institutions to build community, economy, and mutual delight. So we're going to talk a little bit about gifts. First of all, in asset-based community development, we start with the human first in an ecosystem, and humans have gifts, and we describe gifts in ways of hands, head, and heart. Other part of the ecosystem is associations, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But these are folks that also have gifts, and with associations, you have gifts of healthy institutions that is you all. Sometimes associations and institutions can get confused, but they all have separate gifts. And gifts of individuals, you'll find that all of the gifts kind of intertwine. So for an example, in the gifts of individuals, you have a lot of creativity, you have imagination, you have celebration, you have autonomy, but it's limited when it's doing collective action. So gifts of associations they're people who are there because they want to be there. They have a loose structure. They have a nimble meaning, but they all have a common goal. Some of those associations will include your book club, or you have a neighborhood association, but that's a hybrid. People who just hang out at the bus stop when their kids are there, that's an association. And the gifts that associations bring, besides the nimbleness, it also brings collective action, collective power. I contend that associational life is the best way institutions can get involved with individuals in the community. Now, gifts of healthy institutions. What does it mean to be an institution? You have a really confined structure. It is pointed, and mission is pretty exact. They often have power, political power, capital, other resources. They have lots of social capital. Some of its limits, though, come in the form of not always having the privy to be in imagination, to have imagination and use creative processes sometimes without collaboration. Institutions itself, some of the other limitations it has is that it doesn't pull always from the creativity from the people who work there. Here are some of the, again, we just named 3 community assets in individuals, associations, and institutions. There are other 2 community assets that I think that are pretty powerful when it comes to an asset-based ecosystem: physical space and exchange. Exchange can be currency also, so not just physical currency, but social capital, things that people share. Who do you need when you're trying to have an asset-based ecology? Well, you need connectors, identifiers, healers, hosts, And then the one that's not on this screen is storytellers. Connectors are gift-centered, well-connected. They have a powerful currency of trust. People trust them. They believe community is welcoming. So here's an example of way an institution has done that. I worked with the city of Indianapolis during COVID. And if there are people who are familiar with, housing crisis during COVID, we understand that the money there, it was pretty hard to fill out forms right there. And people got a lot of forms, people needed it, a lot of people got denied, even though there were a lot of people helped. We asked the city of Indianapolis to simplify the form, and the main premise is let's believe people that they need these resources, right? And if we're asking a bunch of questions and having 30 pages, then that kind of defeats that person. The other piece is treat people with dignity. And so we got the city to bite into that, and a couple of things that ended up happening. The 30 pages went down to 2 pages, and there were less than a page of questions, and the last 3 questions is what brings you joy, and what is it that you're good enough to show anyone else, and who besides yourself will walk along with you on the journey. That right there got people to share the link in ways. People were excited that they have a place that they felt like people believe them. So trust is a really big thing, and connectors often bring that. An identifier. I played the role as an identifier. It is a person that witnesses people in action, so they know people's gifts. They know where they live, where people live at or hang out at, and they know who vouches for them, who backs their currency. So sometimes when I first started out as the roving listener, my job was to go block to block, house to house, from the youngest to the oldest, and discover the gifts of people in our community and around the 4-block radius around the church. And one of the things that I learned is that, people's gifts need to be tested. So I would always bring people over, some of my friends over, and as they would show me their gifts, I would say, show me. And then either their witnesses or people in their family would show them their gifts. So an identifier. And healer. A healer is a host. These folks that after our programs close down, they're the people who are still activated. They're people who cultivate joy and is sensitive where people experience trauma. They host inspiring events. They're available after work hours. They know other healers, and they have a gift of hospitality. People trust them to be vulnerable. My neighbor, January York, who was in the first page, is that healer. Her title is the cultivator of joy. And oftentimes what she does is host events on her porch or house, in her living room, and her backyard. And she would often invite neighbors to celebrate something, or to even sometimes grieve something. One time, one of our hospitals got a wind that she was doing this, and she set up vignettes and threw a party, and the head of hospital come. And one of the things that happened because of this association of healers that January had, they changed the education requirements for community health workers at the hospital. So she was very responsible of that, and in her work. Storytellers. Our storyteller is the roving illustrator. They're like citizen journalists. They share stories of agency and abundance. They make the invisible visible, right? And they're a trusted source of information. Wild Style, he's a hip hop producer. His work is really centered around storytelling, and he is actually the most trusted news in Indianapolis, basically because he calls things out, be able to bring truth to the surface. But he also is telling stories and using his video camera, or he's a great photographer, showing people in action, doing what we have often overlooked. So hands, head, and heart. I'm glad to hear that people wanting to figure out how we might identify people's gifts. So in the asset-based community development world, we identify gifts in actually 4 areas, but 3 practical way of thinking about it. The one that's not on here is core gifts. These are the things you're born with. Sometimes those things are often, they will never leave you. They oftentimes get you in trouble if they're not doing good. and and often that people recognize them with the nickname. So mine's is people, I kidnap people to fall in love with each other. And every time that we have a gathering, people realize they've been kidnapped to meet some other people. So I often get that. But the others are gifts of the hand, right? Gifts of the head and gifts of the heart. Gifts of the hand are those practical things, skills that you can do with with your hand, artistry, writing, um, woodworking, construction. There are several other things that people could actually do with their hands. And then we have gifts of the head. It is knowledge and information that you're willing to share with others. And sometimes I ask the question to my neighbors and my friends or people I work with is, what is it that you're good enough to teach another person, if asked? And gifts of the heart. Gifts of the heart is the things that move you off the couch, that motivate you to act. These are things that it is hard sometimes to describe in concreteness, but you can describe these things in feeling. So asset mapping. Actually, let me share a little story. I'll go back really quick. Gifts of the hand, head, and heart. Um, we're going to go into asset mapping, but one of the things that I was surprised by identifying how you discover someone's gift is a lot of it is just about being present. So think about you all in your meetings, in your staff meetings, and you start out with asking people from this place that from your place the gifts of the hands, head, and heart, and they all write them down. And you have a discussion about it. How do you know it is their real gift? Well, a couple of things. What being present does is one, watch where they light up at. Watch where people light up. Watch people's body language and watch the people who know them. Oftentimes, people can't name their own gifts because it's not a practice that we all have. So use each other at doing this. You can take 5 minutes at each staff meeting or gathering that you do with your partners or even residents that you work with, and do it in groups. Never do it alone. So asset mapping. Asset mapping is the organizing and utilizing of collected gifts and talents. The golden rule, again, is never to ask someone for their gift if you're not, there's no intention of utilizing that gift. So here's an example of what we did. So after a few years of starting the roving listener, my church wanted to figure out how can they better pull people together. And we used the hands, head, and heart model. And we were very low tech, and it's a lot younger too and more nimble. But we would take sticky notes, and after we multiplied our roving listeners and we hired young people to go meet their neighbors, and their job was to come back and figure out how do we get people together. And so the church would sponsor the space, and we would utilize somebody from the church, some folks from the neighborhood, and the roving listeners and the scribe. And what we did was we named all the gifts and talents. We put them up on 3 sides of the walls and categorized the gifts of the hands, head, and heart. And we started to match people up. So at the end of the week, we would ask people if they would come together, and our church had paid for a meal. So this is what asset mapping looks like. Because we were in the church, we used the name the Fishes and Loaves Room. A little bit of a story here is an example of how gifts can be used to better a community. These doors are all from my neighborhood. There are 120 doors. When we first did this project, it came out of institutions wanting to know who is in our neighborhood, how do we bring art into a neighborhood, and we have a grant for about $100,000 that we would like to invest in that. So some of my neighbors were at the meeting and they came back to me and say, hey, don't we have a list of artists in our neighborhood? And we brought out a list of 45 artists. We had mapped 45 artists around our neighborhood. There's a young man named Gary who's a potter and pretty good woodworker. He designed a project after me and some friends went walking through alleys to find doors that were discarded. And he came back with an idea called perception. So it didn't matter, you know, where you come from, what forms of life there were of that you played a part in. This right here was for everybody to tell their stories. So we paid our neighbors in the list to come up with stories that they can put on front and back of the doors. We had an exhibit, as you see on the screen, and it turned into us doing a mural on our corridor. So all 45 artists had a lot to do with that. And now the same groups of this community folks, about 100 people that we've collected after 8 years, are now buying our own land. So asset mapping is super important. Gardens, everybody know the word food insecurity. We know food desert. We were once labeled as a food desert. There are 110 backyard gardeners in our neighborhood that were unseen. And we invest a lot, our institution invests a lot into food insecurity, but no one ever mapped and known that there were 110 backyard gardeners. On our left, we have Taisha Ahmed, is one of our neighbors behind me. She bought 5 lots and doing urban farming, and these young people she take out of her own pocket and she pay them to learn master gardening, and so they get a certificate each year and they kind of move up. They're now doing supplying food for a grocery store that used to be in a house on our block. On the right, a friend of mine's down the street. Taisha's visiting her. She has a small garden, and Taisha's giving some tips, but she grow chickens. She raised chickens and cultivate eggs, and she lives on the other side. There's also a man that grows 100 pounds of peanuts in Indianapolis. How institutions can utilize an asset map. What I want to start with is that map yourselves, right? Map the your strengths, your gifts, your talents, your weaknesses in the space, because a lot of times we know each other from work, but we don't really know each other's gifts, right? And so a big part of this is about how do we get to know each other? How are we designing ways to be together? Here is is what we started with the Indiana State Museum that ended up doing a strategic plan to do asset mapping in the Black community in Indianapolis abroad, because it was one of the spaces they were missing people from. They weren't touching folks there in our communities. So one of the things that ended up happening, we started with mapping the gifts and talents of the leadership staff of the Indiana State Museum. We went through the process of gifts, hands, head, and heart. We were a little bit more upscale on our technology, so we used Miro to collect those things. And one of the things that we learned is that there were a lot of folks that worked there in the leadership that really want to get to know folks in the community. And so hence where we have this focus group here. So you can do this. And there are 2 people because of this and now on the board of the Indiana State Museum that was in this room. So before I go on,
we have a question.
yes.
Hold on, I gotta find it now. Carol wanted to know if she loves the approach, but or they love the approach. They wanted to know, did the city support this asset mapping, or did philanthropy, the garden, support it?
It was philanthropy that supported that, but we're going to get to the city in a second. Okay. We're going to get back to the city part because that is an interesting thing. We have moved in that space, but philanthropy saw a need in that, and I think philanthropy itself realized this would help some of their donor base. There is a project that at UVA that I worked with, that was a catalyst grant that did some awesome mapping and asset mapping that included community and in Charlottesville abroad, and faculty, staff, and community organizations, called an equity index. And so that's a really good example. And they spent 3 years really cultivating that. And I think the project is now like 6 years in. So the vitality index is an example that can be used across the board. So when you map resources, one of the things that you want to do is, how does this make this work? So the vitality index itself shows what collateral is in a community, what trust can be built, what currencies are there. It measures the intangible and tangible spaces. For an example, it asks about the well-being. We ask who takes care of people in the index. It asks around well-being, about how many times you get to the doctor, do you have a ride, how many friends you got, how many parties do you go to, all the way down to that intangible things. It asks things around money, land, collective action, and it also measures philanthropy. So we used a question with our neighbors that we ask people, how much money do you give to your cousins and friends you never expect back? There are some planning questions, 3 planning questions that's important when you're doing this. We ask the city, as they're taking on this index to put into a wider net, the city of Indianapolis is thinking about housing resources, but also in our neighborhood, we have the highest concentration of Black landowners in the city. The values of that land is not as we went around, no one knew how many Black landowners we had, and we assumed because we had a high vacancy rate that there were no Black landowners. But one of the things that we discovered because of this type of mapping, we found out where gaps were. We found out why banks wouldn't come here, why people's lands were undervalued. Of course, redlining was one of those, but a lot of people didn't know about the resources that helped them value that. So when we talk to the city, one of the 3 questions we ask in the planning, what can we do with our neighborhood resources? What can we do? The second question is, what can we do with our neighborhood resources if we get some outside help? And what can we do with our resources and therefore must be done by outsiders? So these are the questions we were asking each other, especially with the city. And a couple of things they helped do is we needed outside. We got land ownership, but we couldn't buy more land, and we didn't have cash to do that. And we couldn't leverage cash because our land wasn't worth as much as other folks in the city. So through some really good relationships in the city, we got the city to back some investment into our neighborhood, which resulted in like $1.5 million of just land acquisition. The other thing that happened is that the tax experiment put a tax hold on property taxes just in our in about 8 square blocks. Goals of the Vitality Index is to change the narrative. It's a new measure of well-being to create working economies in poor neighborhoods and give people on the margin direct control of their economic lives. So one of the things that being able to rename this tool have helped us rename ourselves in an abundant way that wasn't just about what we needed. Once we did this, we were able to take this to a couple of banks, some investors, and it created relationships that help all of us move forward. So the way institutions can really help with this is to think about the people you serve, right? What if you mapped the gifts and what people could do? It would surprise you on what they offer. And then the next challenge, how do you convene what you find? So here are some of the areas that it measures: social capital in the neighborhood, social capital in the business or in institutions, financial capital, spending in debt across the board with institutions, corporations, and residents. Financial capital personal. So we kind of get into that with residents themselves. Social capital in associations. So think about your institutions. What associations attend or surround your institution? How many times can you tap into that? So a couple of our funders, the Indiana Landmarks and Impact Central, our community foundation, who are doing good work and looking to do the work of equity and community engagement. But they didn't talk to each other. And so listening to them, me and my neighbors, we got them together to think about how preservation, community building, and home ownership can work together. And so they came up with ideas we couldn't have come up with, right? And the other thing is they committed to a longer term relationship to discover what that has. They're sharing their financial capital, help political capital shaping that, so that people will have a fair chance to use their gifts. Here are some examples of an index. I'm going to go quickly through this because you all have the copies of this. There are questions these are just samples of questions. We now have an app that we're working with. So that's a new thing for us. And we trim down some of the questions. I want to remind people how also complex this could be, right? If you think about the people you all are serving, even people on your staff, how many times have, and some of you have big organizations, so like the State Museum, right? They knew everybody in the inner circle, the leadership team, but they have security, they have janitorial staff, they have interns. That's a lot of people to learn. And you don't learn people's gifts overnight. So there has to be kind of a system created and a practice about discovering what that is. And the hard part of this is unlearning the things that we knew previously, which is setting scarcity. So the word need has to look like something else, right? When you use the word need, when we use the word need in our community, it's only used in the way that we ask people, how are you needed in the community? You know, the need to be needed. So think about that when you're discovering that, and how much time, you can't really do this in the survey. Even in the vitality index, we did some door-to-door stuff, but we actually got people together to discuss this. And even neighbors living next door to each other, just like in institutions, they didn't know, one, that they had some didn't know their gifts themselves, but they didn't realize that their neighbor was an artist, and they were looking to hire an artist there. And that door project that I showed you helped cultivate that. The other thing is invest in some learning, right? And so not these workshops are good, but with your staff, one of the things we would do with our staff is do learning journeys to different places. And those learning journeys helped us see ourselves. We would do written letters to different people, MacArthur Genius Award winners. I remember we went to see Dr. John Rich in Philadelphia, and then we saw some other folks, and we took our staff, but we also invited people we worked with, right? We also invited a professor, an artist, a single mom along that group, because the conversations are so much more rich. People see so many different ways. So that's a big part of that. Learning journeys can look very local. If you don't have a lot of resources for your institution, find the things that look abundant. What are the things that, and you don't always have to look for institutions, people who have a nonprofit. My rule is if there are 3 or more people gathered in an association, they have agency. So follow those folks and learn from those folks. Figure out how to have a meal with those folks and invite those folks to talk with your staff and ask really hard questions. Um, the other thing,
DMR,
yes,
someone wanted to kind of go back to something you mentioned with the vitality index. Let me
mhm,
make sure I got the question right. And this is Betsy, who's very inspired. But one specific question on a previous slide, you said that one goal of the vitality index was to create working economies in poor neighborhoods. They didn't understand that, so they want to know what you mean. And could you talk about that a little?
sure. So a couple of things that when I gave the example of we had the highest in Indianapolis, the highest black land on concentrated black land ownership in that place because of our reputation about what people see about us. So, I mean, our zip code, the AMI is about $27,000. So people don't have deep pockets. A lot of other things go along with that. So people's houses are being dilapidated. Um, that means that resources are less likely, abundant resources are less likely to move in that neighborhood because the community seemingly either don't know it's collateral, its own personal collective collateral, or is not seen at all. And so when we would try to get investors and folks to come in our neighborhood to partner with us, the only thing they could think about is crime. So that kind of really devalued stuff. Once we started doing the index, the narrative changed, right? The other things were still true about our neighborhood, but the thing that did change is that there were also other things we could tap into, low hanging fruit. There are other neighbors who were really willing to invest, and there was capital we hadn't tapped into. So what it did is bought us collateral. People started to when we start sharing that story that people wanted to bring economy into our neighborhood. So the corridor that I'm talking about, we just bought a city block. That is an opportunity that wouldn't have happened if we would have named our kept the old narrative what we didn't have. It has also made attention to folks that had overlooked the resources that were already there. Now they wanted to figure out how they can start building relationships with folks. So hence the city helping leverage some of that.
Thank you.
Betsy, that was a great question. Thank you. I know it's hard to think about this as a leveraging opportunity because sometimes we look for volunteers, sometimes we're short on staff, and the people we need is right among us, right? They're right among us. And think about you can take an index like this, and I don't know if you're a library, it will be an easy place, right? So you know all the names of folks who checks books out. Um, the other thing about the index, when we facilitate this, we pay residents to facilitate it, right? And so we put that they are co-owners of that map, um, and they work together with the institutions to figure out how to best use that. So I was talking about learning journeys and how that is very important. And I must say, I said that the people, the leadership team, the people who work for your institutions, people you serve, but especially the board members need to go through learning opportunities. So an example, Texas United Methodist Foundation is a large foundation that gives out money in two states, Texas and New Mexico. They also do they help liquidate churches um, that are just dying and no longer there in a sense, and they take the money and redistribute it. And I'm United Methodist, so that's what kind of my involvement. They are United Methodist funded. One of the things that they start to do is realize that churches are closing down. How do they look at communities as their parishes? And so they wanted to learn how to do that. And they went on learning journeys. They invited us to hang out with them. And I remember the most pivotal learning journey that they went to was we went to Boston and we visited a group of grassroots residents. We went to the folks that won the Nobel Peace Prize before they won it for economics, and we talked to them, and that's where we all learned about how important it is to allow people to fail at things, and that was very pivotal for them. So they go back, and because of that, they come back to create an award called the Tom Locke Leadership Award. And it supported grassroots innovators and gave them funds to innovate, right? And so it was a very powerful moment, their turning point of what they can do with the power they have. So learning journeys, right, influence that. The other recommendations, I have some readings, which also could be learning journeys too. There's a book called Having Nothing, Possessing Everything. I don't have a copy of it, but I'm in it a little bit. But it's written by my good friend of 20 years, Mike Mather, and he's talking about the journey of community using gifts and talents and being an institution and how he navigated that work. So it's a really good read. The other book I felt like that was really good for you all was The Alternative, Mauricio Lynn Miller, What You Believe About Poverty is Wrong. It's less about, to me, about poverty. It's more about change of mindset. Mauricio was a person that he created it was the Family Independence Institute, and now Up Together. And he was out in Oakland, and he was the largest social service agent in the city of Oakland. And he got into a squabble with the mayor at the time, Jerry Brown. And Jerry Brown called him a poverty pimp. Now, Mauricio is a son of immigrants, and he believed in helping people, but it didn't change the numbers there. So after the argument happened, ensued, and was over, Mauricio went and talked to his mom, and this is what the book is about. It's really great, and she shared stories of why you listen and don't get in the way of people you serving. And so he fired all of the social workers. I hope nobody's on social workers. I'm not saying anything bad about social workers, but what he did in place is use the money to allow people to discover their own paths in collectives or cohorts. It was a part of like some guaranteed income work. So anyway, so that's some recommended readings. There are others. These two folks would definitely love a visit from you all. You could even, I know Mike, he would definitely be someone that you could hang out with, and you could Zoom. And Mauricio he's busy, but you can visit him. So thank y'all for allowing this presentation. I hope there are lots of questions, and here's my contact.
Thank you so much. There's probably more comments than questions, and I think what's going to happen is people are going to ask questions now that you're done. So I'll start with a question, then I'll go ahead and change over. So one of the questions we have, you said early on there were two, so I'm going to let you leave your PowerPoint up in case people want to see it, but that there were two additional area of gifts in addition to hands, head, and hearts. Could you say what those two are? And I think maybe you went to it after.
I did.
Okay, so yeah, this is just a early question.
It's one. It's core gift. It's a core gift. So that's the fourth. And a core gift is something you're born with, right? I have a story about that. I hang out in Toronto. A friend of mine is on the Institute. She's no longer with us, but Judith Snow. I love John McKnight's work, but I probably am a disciple of Judith Snow. She, a woman that was quadriplegic. In her younger years, she was brought to an institution, and her friends kidnapped her out. And later on, because of that, they discovered her gift. She became a professor. One of the most genius people I've ever met. We've hired her to come here to hang out with us. But one of the things she would often do, she was like Robin Hood and the band of married people. And she lived in the co-op apartments. And one of her people that hung tough with her was a lady named Miriam. Now, Miriam, every day she would visit people, knock on almost all the doors in her high rise. And people also, like Miriam, had bad timing too. So that was the other thing around Miriam knocking on doors. But she did this every day. She didn't stop. She was checking on people. You know, despite people being a little upset with Miriam, one time there was a fire in the building. Guess who knocked on every door? Miriam, right? That is something Miriam could not turn off. If you met Miriam today, you'd understand why. That's her gift.
I love that because yeah, you could definitely see that as in other times probably a little annoying.
Yeah,
So,
I
but
had
hey,
myself.
all right. Okay. And then Marianne, and somebody had asked you to go back to a slide. I'm just gonna say, whoever it was who wanted to go back to a slide, just put it in the questions again, and just say what slide you were talking about because I don't know. Okay. So, but I want to leave your slideshow up while they get that back in.
Right?
Carol wants to know, can you talk more about the process to identify things that people are willing to give up and how that works in practice? I'm trying to get at the kinds of barriers you have faced in this kind of process and moving through it.
Yes. So I'm going to give an example and hope this helps. One of the groups we work with on our consulting side is Central Indiana Community Foundation. And a couple of things preamble to the work we're doing. What we did is designed, the Learning Tree designed a community ambassador program based on the roving listener work. And 9 organizers, 10 now, in 9 different neighborhoods that are mislabeled. CICF, or Indianapolis Foundation itself, um, made a commitment to dismantle systemic racism. And they went through all the trainings and all of that stuff, but nothing was activated. This was a place they could activate and learn from people who they call ambassadors. Now, here's the power side and sharing power, giving up something, right? That the foundation wanted to make them employees, that we asked them not to make them employees. And matter of fact, you can't pay them for what they're worth, right? You couldn't pay them for their gifts. But what you could do is supplement their time that you grab and pay them for what they already do, and you learn from them. And so the institution itself, CICF and Indianapolis Foundation, committed to every few weeks hanging out with residents. And these 9 residents would take folks to a community. One of our biggest starts of this, I think the CEO now really experienced it. He would often not come to meetings and could just come hang out and observe with friends and have meals in our neighborhood. And so part of that vulnerability there, you're giving up power. The other thing is language is a big part of giving that up, is that there needs to be some institutional grasp of how we might identify what power is. And so when we think about power broken, that meetings shouldn't happen always in your institution. So that was one of the things they gave up. They would have meetings in our neighborhood. The community leadership officers would just have lunch without any agenda except to learn who people were and what their work was.
Thank you. Victoria wants to know, how are you submitting your requests to the city for support? So you've mentioned the city a couple of times and ways that you were able to make things move, like the 30-page document into 2. How are you submitting those requests or making those relationships?
So the relationship piece is the piece. Our deputy mayor, who is head of policy now, we've been knowing each other for a long time, and there were times that him and I just didn't see eye to eye, and I probably just had a blind eye to what he had offered. But my neighbor, one of the things that he started doing and noticing with a lot of the social capital that people had, and social capital myself, that sometimes I would overlook, he would just take them for walks. He would take the CEO of the community foundation for a walk, and he would purposely walk them through our neighborhood, and he would stop and have lunch and invite other folks. That totally changed. That happened with Jeff. I should have put up an article from Duke Divinity that talked about I can send that to y'all, but talked about the grant program. And one of the things that we got him to do is we asked him, as in relationship, do you trust this work? And we challenged him to utilize it. And so he went back, and he's the head of something, and he can make decisions based on relationships. And most people do anyway. I think the absence of this was that residents don't often have those personal relationships with policymakers or with the city. So we also made good connections. He learned that we had connections that he could utilize to advance his work. So our relationship with the community foundation was a big part of that.
I appreciate that. And I like that answer, because I think sometimes you might be thinking, people are like, well, I don't know the person. But if you do the asset mapping part and you find out people's gifts, there may be connections that you kind of have overlooked before or didn't realize. I can't remember the name of it right now, but there's kind of this circle that people do, where if you have at least, I don't know, 4 or 5 people in the room and you ask for something that you need, someone knows someone that can get that for you. So
Yeah.
it's interesting if you do it that way.
And remember the slide that I had with the roles. This is where in your institutions, identifying those roles, the storyteller, the identifier, the healer, and the connector. You identify those, this work's become much easier. One of the things that my church did when I was working in that program is they identified me as a resident that lived in that neighborhood. Mike, who wrote the book Having Nothing, Possessing Everything, was brilliant at identifying what I was already good at. What was it that is easy to give? And so that's how I approach that when it comes to relationships, and that's how it's related to gifts. Find those folks, right? Those 4 identities in your institution. Matter of fact, they don't all have to be in your institution, but they should work together. It's a really it takes a lot of pressure off, because the work takes time. So don't think that after 1 year you're going to get this and it's going to go, because you have a whole mission that may or may not be part of this. And there are things in your institution you're going to have to figure out. How do we move this out the way? What things can we move out the way? So think about that.
Okay. Jay says, and back to the idea of any group of 3 people or more, do you mean talking to, for example, for social clusters that have no official role but are known as neighborhood institutions for social connection?
Yes, that's what I mean. And the way I identify them, I have kind of a matrix. Are they philanthropic in nature? Are these folks always bringing new people to the center of their organization or this little cluster or association of folks? Are they good facilitators? Do they have a form of way of connecting people? And can they tell stories about the common? Right. And so that's important, because a lot of times we confuse agency with institution. Institution they do have agency, but the agency I'm talking about is more of a common good. Does this affect outcomes of other people?
Thank you. Okay. And hold on, somebody had a really, oh, can you just repeat Miriam's last name again?
I don't remember Miriam's last name, but it was Judith Snow.
Okay.
Judith has a few books that, and she was a good friend of Miriam's.
Okay, gotcha. Miranda found the slide, so Miranda's good. And the other 2 community assets. Also, Miranda would love to hear how philanthropy could potentially work in tandem with asset-based community development.
Well, I would like to, a couple of things. The slide, which slide was it? Let me start there.
Looks like, let me see, the way Miranda's saying it, it sounds like it was the one with the gifts. Let me make sure. Miranda said, the 5 community assets.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
I need to go back. Oh, there it is. That's the gifts of individuals, associations, institutions, physical space, and exchange.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
So how can philanthropy, work more with this, you think?
Well, a couple of things is that philanthropy is an easy thing. Is that we have to examine grant making first. A lot of the grant making is based on need of what people don't have. And if one of the things that we play around when we apply for grants is what is the biggest need in your community? We answer the biggest need is the need to be needed. But also look at your grant form. Have your folks have your own team fill it out, fill your own grants out, and find out where there are gaps in around the word need, right? So try to figure out. So a good example is self-development of people. I don't know if you know, it's been in existence a fund that Presbyterians created about 50 years ago, but it doesn't fund institutions. It funds folks in those areas most needed, right? And what they do is they give the money directly to people. It requires 10 people to be together. Now, you can't apply for this grant if you don't have 10 folks you know well. That's one way. Put it in your matrix in your grant making that you're encouraging people to build bonds together. So that's one way to do it. The other thing is you can help other institutions that are currently getting grants to shape their relationship. So to receive a grant, you have to figure out what percentage the Birmingham Foundation was doing this work, Community Foundation. They were doing an asset-based community development training, but they understood that the institution is really going there to figure out how to get money. So they put really concrete things in there that what percentage of your neighbors do you know? What gifts do they have? So you can do that, but also start mapping the passions of people on your staff. That's a place that I would ultimately start at and see how they might intersect with what people fund and find ways that the community leadership officers itself who come in first contact, how are they out in community looking for things that aren't always present?
Thank you. Brandy says, we are a fledgling community land trust located on Long Island, New York. As such, we find that most people are sheltered here. How would you suggest we attempt breaking through those walls?
And one of the best way to break through some of those barriers is throw parties. So one of the ways we got connected to all of our connections and built our social capital, but also built bonds we don't have control over now, is we threw parties. And we look for, and that's the responsibility of healers and hosts. There are people that naturally throw parties who are festive, and I know you probably can identify those in your workplace, who's always dressed up doing stuff, who's always going to a party, and infuse your social capital into that. So my neighbors, I have lots of social capital, and my neighbors got wind of like how many people come over to my house, and they learned that this is trusted social capital. Now my neighbors are really good party throwers, but they tap me and say, "Why don't you invite this person to our party? And why don't you invite the head of the library to our party? Why don't you invite the head of the state museum?" And I didn't realize how much that changed the complexion. Now, there are things you do around that. Lots of times folks in other institutions may not think like the way we're thinking about. They're coming to bring their business card, they're going to do networking. You want to make sure that's checked at the door, but parties. The other one I mentioned is learning journeys. How do you take a few folks from your community and go see something outside the island that might be good? I mean, one of the things I think about directly that's in Manhattan, I think on the upper west side is the Bridge Project. Is a guaranteed income place. That would be very intriguing to go see and take people to have conversations about.
While you breathe for a second, and now we'll look at our faces and get more questions. I think, Nancy had said you referenced learning journeys, and can you say more about that? And so you kind of just did, and
But
just wanted to make sure.
I
Go ahead.
will. I do want to go more. I was just thinking about Some other really good learning journeys, and I'm gonna
Yeah, go ahead.
in Kansas City and also New York, Orange, New Jersey. There are two fledgling universities of the people, like free universities. Mindy Fuller Love, who has Orange University, that they practiced that everybody has something to teach one another, and there's some accreditation there, so people in Orange can sign up as professors and teachers. In Kansas City, Missouri, Daryl and Stephanie run a little outfit called Eastside University. It's kind of the same thing where it's based out of a neighborhood. The campus is an actual neighborhood, and each house is a learning space. And one of the things that they get to do in this learning journey is take institutions that are invested in development, community development, and philanthropy to learn in education, to learn what is available in the neighborhood that they can shape their institutions around instead of looking at a census tract saying, hey, this is what these folks need. So anyway, that's those are learning journeys there. But you want to make sure that that is not just people in your institutions. You want to grab somebody you serve, and you want to invest in that learning journey. So you need a little money. You want to figure out where you stand and where you're going. So if you're going to see Daryl and Stephanie, they would definitely figure out ways to put you up. Mindy Full of Love, that's a day trip for some folks in New York City or the Bridge Project, and ask them, say, hey, we'd like to take you out to lunch or dinner. After the learning journey, the purpose of the best parts of the learning journey is the in-between spaces. So you don't just go straight through. You might have a break in between, and then there's dinner at night. That is where the most change come from, in the reflection about you're not going to do what they're doing, but you're going to look where imagination with a group of people you didn't know as well. So it's a community building activity. The other thing is going back is that you have to share out, right? So how are you sharing this out in a corporate way, right? To all the folks involved, all the levels of people that have something to do with your institution. And the folks that went on the learning journey will share out what they imagine now for the future, what they learned, and ways that other people can get involved with this vision.
Jacqueline is obviously in Atlanta and wants to know, is there anything you can, are there any learning journeys or anything related to the Institute in Atlanta that they could learn from?
All over Georgia. For a long time, the Council on Developmental Disabilities created a project called Real Communities, which I was involved in the beginning. There in Clarkston, there is Bosmont, who is an asset-based organizer in an immigrant community, doing some really good work there. There are several folks that Macon, Georgia. There's some work there. Savannah, Columbus. There's some regionally. There's a lot of things to go. Also, there's Professor Ellison, Dr. Greg Ellison, who's at Candler right now, who is a interesting practitioner around conversations. Would be interesting for any folks at any place to go meet.
Okay, thank you. Lauren had a good question here. How are you able to narrow down priorities within your vitality indexes to fit your community?
So part of that is done with good researchers and aggregation. So there's an aggregation process that gives some quantitative and qualitative story. And then what we do is we gather the community back together, the facilitators that we paid, and we affirm those. And if they don't sound right, the community is leading, no, this is not right. We meant this. So after aggregating, we go back into affirm, get it declared, and then we move on it. In that stage, we invite others from the outside to hear this. And we purposely think about people in healthcare, housing, economic development, banking, and spirituality.
Okay. Brandy wants to know, are consulting services offered by the Learning Tree?
Yes, that's how we give our grants out. Is that we do some strategic plans. We have done some, and we do coaching, um, curriculum design. We do a lot of different pieces of work. We have many different like parties that work with us. So we hire consultants from the community. So January is a positive psychologist. Her expert is curriculum design. So you'd get her somebody in
Okay.
January telling. Yeah, so we have folks. We do consulting work.
Awesome. That's okay. You're getting all the business, just so you know, everyone's going to be reaching out. Since you mentioned Georgia, now I have Minneapolis, Minnesota, Baltimore, Maryland, Colorado. So people just want to know, is there kind of a catch-all, I don't know, website or somewhere we can go and kind of understand where asset-based community development is happening, and what can we do to learn more?
I haven't put a list together, but I could quickly get a list to send it out to you all. I think the Colorado thing, there's the author of the Having Nothing Possesses Everything is in Boulder, Colorado.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, now someone said Charlotte. Okay, so so everybody wants to
I
know.
can get a list. I probably can find
Okay,
some most of the states.
thank you. And we're we send the email in, what's today? Oh, today's Thursday. Okay, so probably tomorrow, if you could get it. And if not, we have the guest list, so we can always send it a little later if possible. Okay. Sandra said that you mentioned what boards should do, but then you didn't finish saying what it was. So
Well,
if you recall, can you tell us?
yes, I do. I think boards are the most important part of this work. Oftentimes, boards get in the way of the people that work for them, their imagination, and part of it is just because they're not in proximity. So help boards become in proximity. So on these learning journeys, if you take a learning journey, boards should be involved. Sometimes things without agendas, right? So if there's a party, make sure a board member is at the party. So if the president of the organization and employees are going, there should be the board chair and some folks there because you want them to do the same process that we're asking you and institutions to do, right? And if you're doing it and they're not, and I ran into this a lot, is not making sure board members are doing some form of this practice. They don't need to do the day-to-day stuff, but how are they connecting their social capital to the efforts, right? Board members often have more social capital than they actually put into their organizations they're serving.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And people are always, we work here at Candid and we do a lot around just sustaining your nonprofit, doing things more efficiently. And people always have questions about boards and how to engage them. This sounds like, hey, here's one way, especially if raising money is a little scary for some of them, depending on your board members or their age, or people are trying to diversify their boards more. So they may have a, 25-year-old board member who doesn't have the kind of money where they can give, but they can, use these other talents. So thank you for mentioning that. Let's see what else we have. You mentioned the journeys already. We got your consulting services down, and I think we have the website and everything. Um, we had, I'm trying to find, okay, FR Douglas said, hello from Zambia. Can you talk more about the ABCD Institute? I'm interested in the ABCD model.
Absolutely. Um, you can, I forget that you can easily find it, but it is an institute. It's out of DePaul University. There are there's a website with different menus. They can do trainings. They do a lot of that work. They do some other types of technical support with funding through the DePaul University side. The other thing is there are a lot of places in Africa. There's like an ABCD Institute. South Africa would be um, somebody that I would reach out to. There's one in Europe, and there's an ABCD affiliate that in New Brunswick, Canada, and I'm blanking on the name right now, but they're really good. They do a lot of things that's overseas, but a lot of their materials are free. With the ABCD Institute, you can get the Green Book downloaded for free. I can also send you a manual. It's about 80 pages, if that would be helpful too.
Oh my, thank you. I just saw a question I wanted to. So a couple of things. Nicholas says we are planning our first forum. Is there a package having information about like a how-to package? And I don't know if that's what you just kind of gave us.
Yeah, yes, it's somewhat of a how-to, but what I would suggest is that you go to a full ABCD training in person. If anybody's close to you, do a train the trainer thing. We often do that. We working with our local university to do certification for asset-based community development. But there are others. I know there's a group in North Carolina that is doing that work. So ask to figure out how to do the train the trainer first. One of the things I beware people of, that there are a lot of trainers around there, but you want a trainer to do train the trainer that is a practitioner. That could actually say, if you brought them in, not only do they teach you the language, but they walk you through your own place to help you develop that. So, but there are some really good ones out there. John McKnight would probably be the best, I would think, but he's getting up in age and he's not traveling anymore.
Oh, we just called that John McKnight for being old now. Anyway,
He said it.
our our letter says, wait, I just wanted to read that. Oh, okay, I think Ebony moved it. But the comment was that it was easy to sign up just now online at the ABC Institute. So ABCD Institute. So I guess they signed up, whatever that exactly means. And then Caitlin wanted to, so Caitlin's at a big organization. So when you ask the question, will you be able to use asset mapping? Caitlin said, maybe. I work at a very big organization, so there may be some roadblocks to being able to use this for our programs and actually find a way to use the assets that are identified. Do you have any suggestions or examples of how that's been done in a very big institution?
I think a couple of things with Texas Methodist Foundation is really big institution. Has national reach, but I think um, I think there's an audit you should do. There's this readiness thing that I talked about, is first asking the question and then find out where it might be easiest to happen at. And so instead of trying to think about the whole organization, is there a department, or is there a sub department, or is there a small people to experiment with this to have something to present? Um, but the audit would come first, because I can tell you, in a very large organizations, there'll be policies and practices that kind of counter this work. So you'd have to figure out ways that corporately I mean, that exploratory could be a year and a half, to be honest with you, to discover that. And so it should be part of your strategic plan, if possible. Um, yeah, that's a whole loaded thing. You'll have to have a lot of funerals over 18 months.
I love that. Can you explain the funerals a little bit more?
Yeah, so my church got involved. We were doing things counter to asset-based community development. You know, we really wanted to help people. Lilly Endowment is in our backyard, so they were one of our biggest funders, and they funded traditional programs. We had um, programs. We had served 250 young people each summer. We did programmatic stuff that is pretty good, but it didn't change the odds in the place. And we really were thinking about, how do we change the odds in our neighborhood? What we realized is that there were lots of things in our structure that one was unattended to. One of those was that we had 187 committee slots for the last 55 years by the time I got there. We used to be the largest organization, church. We had 3,000 members in the whole state. We were largest. And we dwindled down, and we didn't prepare for this. And so what we realized, when we were going to meetings reporting, that we were just reporting on things we were feeling bad about. So the funerals came out because we have a place where we gather everybody, and that's a Sunday. we created a funeral for things that was not happening. And the first thing was this clothing pantry we used to do for the community. And across the street, there was a lady that wanted to use our space to do her own clothing store that she was doing out of her house. But the members there, the board was like, no, we can't do that. We got our own thing. It didn't exist. Well, one Sunday, we went down and asked everybody that was involved to stand up in a very public way that had something to do with this clothing pantry. And then we celebrated it and said it was good. And then we said, well done, good and faithful servants. The funniest thing is that there was a silence for 30 seconds. But the cool thing, we knew it was dead. In a week, they cleared out all the clothes that was in that pantry that just was piled up. The community wasn't hearing about it. And then we start burying every quarter for like 2 years, all the things that got in the way of us investing in new things. After that opened up the door to bring this lady who did not go to the church to come in to tell her story. And that's how our store started. But it takes that commitment, especially for those large place institutions.
That is amazing. I'm not going to keep you any further because we pretty much got all the questions. I just want to thank you. I can't read like all of the comments, but there's so many great things. People are really thanking you. They feel like they're going to use this. Let me read. Trish said, super beautiful. Venus said, such a beautiful vibe. I could listen for hours. So I don't know if you have a podcast or anything, but people can listen to you for hours, just so you know. Suzanne said, I'm very inspired by your work and have to, she had to leave early, but she was very inspired by your work. And like I said, Jay mentioned being blown away because this was so humane, which I love that word. Ben said, I'm looking at asset mapping as a tool to strengthen our self-understanding as a virtual-based community of organizations where a network of orgs looks valuable in our setting, our support collaboration. So lots and lots of thank yous, including my own. I'm so glad that you agreed to do this because I think more people need to hear abundance, and I don't think that we hear it enough. So thank you once again. And I'm just gonna say to everyone, a reminder that you will get the recording of this and you'll also get a survey at the end of this. And we're really looking at survey data right now with Candid to make sure that we're doing really good work. So if you like this webinar, please let us know, or let us know what you need from us. We're trying to listen as well. And before we sign off, I'm just gonna remind you that, again, you will get the recording in a couple of days, and also the lists that Diaman has promised us. If you like this webinar,
right now.
You put it together right. He's writing it on paper, y'all.
I am writing, but Amanda,
I do that too. And if you like this webinar, we hope you'll join us again soon. So that's it. We want to say thank you and have a great day to everyone. Thanks again, Diaman.